Hello, this is David Rovics hosting another live stream broadcast, which is appearing on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, Cable Community Radio, and various other platforms. During the pandemic, since I can no longer tour and play music for a living, I've taken to interviewing people of interest most weekdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT, and doing a house concert from my living room on the last Saturday of every month at 1 p.m. Pacific, along with various other live streaming activities. Every Tuesday, the broadcast has an actual producer, longtime Detroit area talk show host and Fifth Estate magazine editorial collective member, Peter Werby. These days, Fifth Estate is a quarterly print magazine that has been published in one form or another since its founding in 1965. You can read the entirety of the spring issue online at fifthestate.org. The summer issue is coming right up. You can subscribe to it at fifthestate.org and hear previous episodes of Fifth Estate Live there as well. Today's guest is Seth Tobocman, an extraordinary cartoonist and artist who has been living in New York City's Lower East Side since 1978, making great art and getting into a lot of trouble. He put out a number of books in graphic novel form, including War in the Neighborhood and After the Crash, Explaining Economics with Eric Lorson. Seth founded World War III Illustrated, a pioneering graphic novel series that began well before the term graphic novel was invented. His work has won awards and taken him around the world, but I believe his entire and lengthy arrest record all happened in New York City. He'll also be doing the cover art for the upcoming issue of Fifth Estate. Seth, welcome to my
Hey, how you doing?
show.
Thank you
Yeah, great.
on the Fifth Estate show.
Great to have you.
The Fifth Estate is a magazine that my best friend Paul Shetler showed me when I was in high school, and he said, "This is an anarchist magazine." So I'm finally doing something with Fifth Estate.
Great. Yeah, it's been a while then. I think the first time I actually, I don't know if you're in the same apartment that I visited you in 1988, but I was like, I guess 21 years old visiting Mary Lou Manning in New York City. And
oh my God, yeah.
And she took me to your apartment. And I think, I don't know when you had started World War III Illustrated. I think, was it fairly recently before then? I think we were looking at a whole bunch of pages of
we
art.
started it in 1979.
Okay, 79. So you'd been going a long time. That's when I first discovered you and your work.
Out in 1980, but we started working on it in 79.
So there's a heck of a lot I want to ask you about, but you've got a presentation all ready to go, and I'm afraid that half my questions are going to be things you talk about in there. So it's probably best if we start there, and then we'll talk after.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. My artwork speaks for me far better than I do, I hope.
I don't know. Well, this is why we do these things, you know. Yeah. So we've practiced the screen share, and for anybody listening later in podcast form, you know, I don't know what kind of experience they'll have with this, but we'll just hopefully they can watch the video.
Okay, you got the screen share?
And there it's on screen share. Yeah, and I'll just take us.
Okay, so you see a flaming woman with a phoenix rising behind her?
Yeah, same thing you should be looking at, right?
Okay, good. That's what we got. So I'm going to start with some recent pieces. I don't know if I've got it. You don't know if you've got it. We don't know if it's safe to shake hands, or to touch the screen of an ATM, or to ride a subway, or to go shopping. I don't know if a walk in the park will kill me. You don't know if hugging your child will kill you. A child doesn't know if hugging a parent will kill that parent. We don't know how many are healthy. We don't know how many are sick. We don't know because we don't have enough test kits. And we don't have enough test kits because the US government refused to import test kits from Europe. They preferred to invent a test of their own, which didn't work. We don't know why they made this decision. They say it's standard procedure. We do know that the Trump administration has blood on its hands because we know that refrigerated trailers are filling up with bodies. We know that we deserve better. This was written in March of 2020 when we did not know. And this one is called Back to Work. They want us back to work at jobs that aren't safe. This is not an exaggeration. They want to reopen restaurants where we can get sick. Are we really going to eat at these restaurants? They want to reopen schools where teachers and students can infect each other. Will we all wear hazmat suits? No, seriously, that's not a joke. Are they going to give me a hazmat suit? Trump has used the Defense Production Act to keep open meat packing plants where workers have died of COVID-19. They want us back to work so they can stop paying unemployment benefits. They want small businesses to reopen and then go under so they don't have to bail them out. Why should we work in conditions that will kill us? First, we solve the medical problem, then we restart the economy. Capitalists should not get to sit safely in their gated communities while the rest of us die. Written on May Day of 2020, when they wanted us back to work. This is an older piece called What You Need to Know. What you need to know is that heat from the sun is trapped by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, warming the earth, making life possible. And you need to know that burning oil and coal emits extra greenhouse gases, causing the earth to overheat, causing drought, melting the polar ice caps, causing the seas to rise and the land to flood. And you need to tell people that when the temperature at the ocean surface reaches 80 degrees, hot air rises off the water. Then cooling in the upper atmosphere, the air falls, creating a vortex, becoming a hurricane. And the cities bleed. And you need to tell people that forests absorb greenhouse gases, and cutting down forests releases these gases. So if we stop logging and replace oil and coal with other forms of energy, then the earth can slowly heal. An automobile is a machine for transportation. A multinational corporation is a machine for making money. They're not in business to do anything else. Ask them, they'll tell you. So they won't stop until we stop them. To fight for survival is human nature. So we, the people, will rise up against these corporations. What you need to know is that you are the solution. And this is a piece I did in the 1980s. It's in a stencil form, and it was originally painted on the sidewalks around the Lower East Side. The world is being ripped by men who trade in human blood. They have no future. You will never succeed in joining their club. Don't believe what they tell you. Their weapons won't protect you. People aren't out to get you. You don't have to fuck people over to survive, or yourself. The dog imitates the master, but only eats the leftovers. He has power over another man's life, but none over his own. Unite. We can't lose. There are millions of us. And that piece was originally published in our magazine, World War III Illustrated. And here you see the cover of the first issue that came out in 1980, the cover by Ben Hillman. And here is the cover of the new issue that has just come back from the printers this week. The cover is by Jose Munoz, one of my lifetime heroes. And the title of this issue is The World We're Fighting For. And this issue contains work by some of my lifelong friends like Peter Cooper and Sandy Jimenez, Eric Drucker, Mac McGill, Anton Van Dalen, Sue Coe, who was always one of my heroes, Sue Saminsky-Beatala, who lives in Milwaukee and did a lot of work to fight fossil fuel infrastructure there. But we also wanted to include some younger artists like Colleen Tye, Killjoy, Beck Young, Sasha Hill and Annabelle Heckler, J.B. Bradger, and Ethan Heitner. And that's why this issue is over 200 pages long, because we needed to put in all these artists. Artists I've known all my life, artists I've just met. And we're really happy to publish all of these artists. And you might ask, how do I get a copy of this magazine? Some of you may remember, we used to sell this at Tower Records. We used to sell this at all these little anarchist bookstores and all these punk shops. And a lot of those places are gone. And right now, even mainstream bookstores are closed. Even mainstream comic shops are closed because of COVID-19. So how do you get a magazine like this? You can order it online from AK Press, and here is the email that you can order it from. akpress.org/world we are fighting for. Send to that email and you can get the copy. But I want to talk about another magazine also, which is The Fifth Estate. And I was asked to do a cover for the current issue of The Fifth Estate, and they told me that the theme was where we live. So I thought about that, where we live. Well, we're all supposed to be working where we live. This seems to be the new model of capitalism, that where we live is our place of employment. But where we live is also where we make dinner. Where we live is also where we make love. Where we live is where some of us raise children, and where some of us work on our art, and where some of us work on our head. And we might be living in a squatted building. We might be living in a rented apartment. We might own our home. And we might even have solar panels on the roof. But we've all got a lot to worry about, because we might also be living out in a homeless encampment, in a tent, or we might be in a hospital, or we might be in prison. And the place we live is being threatened. Who's it being threatened by? It's being threatened by capitalism. That's who's threatening the place we live, who wants us to be continually insecure. So where we live is actually something we fight for. Where we live is a battle cry. And that's the theme of the new issue of the Fifth Estate.
Fantastic cover. Great.
That's it.
Brilliant, Seth. Wonderful. And folks, you're listening to Fifth Estate Live, which comes to you every Tuesday on various platforms, including the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance and KBOO Community Radio. You can find all the episodes archived in audio form at fifthestate.org, where you can also subscribe to the Fifth Estate print magazine and get the issue that has that gorgeous cover on it. I was wondering about that one thing. One of the many things you mentioned in that slideshow there about the. I mean, you got when you started actually getting your work out there in physical form in stores where people could find it in stores. It was more in the punk scene than in places that people might think that they're going to find such work. And then, as you mentioned, so many of the places where people might have found such work later, like bookstores, mostly have closed up, and most of the publishing industry has collapsed in the past 20 years, as with the music industry, both of which might have had some kind of impact on you. And I wonder, like, just starting on a really practical note, and as a artist, putting out physical material, like what's it been like for you with the collapse of the publishing industry?
Well, it's very complicated. I started out as a comic book fan. The art I looked at was printed, published art, and I've never felt comfortable just doing art and sticking it in a drawer. I've always felt it had to be in print. It had to be available to people in an affordable format. I don't like to do any work if I don't know where it's going. I also grew up admiring, people like Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Barry Smith, Jim Steranko, who were working artists. It was their job, and they produced it for masses of people. And I wanted to be able to do that. But when we started to develop the magazine, we saw there was not a sympathetic distribution system for the points of view that we were producing. There wasn't, the comic book people wanted you to do capes and tights. The political people didn't have any use for comics. The mainstream media had become, in the 1970s and 80s, very hostile to the left, far more than they are now, actually, because that was the Reagan era. And so we had to produce our own way of getting it out. We produced our own magazine, and we could not initially get distribution in the comic book shops, and we sought our distribution in the punk scene. The punk scene, particularly the punk scene from the West Coast, even though we were New Yorkers, the punk scene on the West Coast did a great job of distributing us through Mortem Records, which was the distribution system for Maximum Rock and Roll and for the Dead Kennedys albums. And so for the first 2 decades of our work, we were really distributed by the punk scene. And eventually the music industry collapsed and we had to move into other venues. And for a while, we were actually getting some distribution in the comic book shops. I found the comic book shops are very conservative. They didn't really, I saw reviews in comic book blogs that were refreshingly honest. They would say, basically, if you like Mao, buy this magazine, I mean, they really were that upfront, they were not catty like the New York Times, but they were straight up. These guys are lefties, don't read them.
That's kind of interesting to me.
I actually got a letter from someone that said, I read a review that said this was a communist magazine, so I want to buy a copy.
Oh, great. Well, that's good. At least it worked, at least in that instance.
At this point, actually, we're recovering some of our distribution because AK Press has taken us on as an imprint, and we're being marketed as a book because the magazine distribution system in this country has completely collapsed.
Yeah.
But the book distribution system is actually pretty healthy up until COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm finding that my books are selling decently online. I've been surprised, actually. I just came out with a book called The Face of Struggle from AK Press, and I thought it would do very badly because of the fact that there were no stores. But actually, its initial sales are about the same as other books. So apparently people are ordering it online, going to the AK Press website, or to Amazon or wherever, and they're ordering copies. So, I am grateful for that, although I think it's really sad to be losing bookstores like Blue Stockings, which weren't just places where people bought books. They were places where people met and hung out.
Blue Stockings closed?
I've heard that they have.
I didn't know.
I haven't been over there lately, which
right.
is something right there. But I've heard that they're closing. I might be wrong.
Mm.
I'm wrong.
But there's so many bookstores closing, and of course that was the case before the pandemic. But the pandemic is really
bookstores were actually recovering before the pandemic. They were
after the big closures like Borders and stuff.
Yeah. And the small bookstores were recovering. And again, the small bookstores don't have quite the overhead problem as Borders, because so many people who work in those bookstores are volunteers. They're very idealistic places.
And nice things about books, you don't need a battery, and then you don't need a book player to put the book in either.
So, I like handling magazine,
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's something from my childhood. So some people had a teddy bear. I had a comic book.
I grew up on Marvel comics from a very early age, and actually I didn't know you were so influenced by Jack Kirby, but I see a lot of his influence in your work, actually, now that you mentioned when I came across the name. But what Marvel comics, actually, I mean, I always thought as a kid that there's some pretty serious moral questions that are being raised, and very, very unlike DC comics, where things are so straightforward, like good and evil, the laws are good guys, and everybody, and the criminals are bad guys. And with Marvel, it's much more complex. Like the good guys are the mutants who are being persecuted by the police, and they're trying to save humanity while they fight the army at the same time. This kind of thing.
Well, Stan Lee was a Jewish liberal of
Mm-hmm.
generation, and he had the attitudes of a Jewish liberal of his generations. So was Jack Kirby. I mean, I would not say they're radical. In fact, I'm sure Stan Lee would say he's not a radical.
Mm.
But I think that they were clearly liberals, and they were clearly in their way anti-racist.
Mm-hmm.
Although there are some rather disturbing racial stereotypes in some of Jack Kirby's work, which I just think are cliches he inherited from the comic book industry.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a lot of right-wing in the comic book world. Steve Ditko is fanatically right-wing. Frank Miller is fanatically right-wing. Will Eisner, who's probably the most influential figure in comic books, never met a ethnic stereotype he didn't find useful in his work. I mean, you read through his books and every single stereotype, not only blacks, but Italians, Irish, every stereotype of his generation is represented in his work. And in fact, he even wrote an essay defending the use of stereotype, which is very hard to find now. Nobody wants to publish that essay, but I read it. And he felt that stereotype was a very easy way to communicate because people already know it.
It is kind of shorthand, right? I mean, when I think of stereotypes that are maybe less offensive, like the classic sort of early 20th century robber baron as depicted in so many IWW cartoons. I mean, it's kind of like, oh, okay, we know we're talking about a capitalist, right? And there he is in his hat,
Sure.
that hat that capitalists wear. Yeah.
Sure. Whereas, our capitalists today look like Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, exactly.
Really,
they don't wear those hats. No.
Artist is like, today our capitalists spend a lot of money making themselves look good. They have a personal trainer. They get plastic surgery. They manage to make themselves look better than anyone. So that's a very interesting problem for a cartoonist. But yeah, comics are an interesting tradition, and I value comics a lot.
Seth, when I was remembering when I was 21 years old in 1988 and visiting my friend Mary Lou, our mutual friend Mary Lou in New York City, and she had moved. We were roommates in Berkeley, California, just the year before then, and then she moved back to her home in New York, and I went to visit her, and it was really, I guess I was there for one of the riots at Tompkins Square, and then it was either that morning or the next morning. We went to your apartment, and I saw World War III Illustrated that you were working on at the time. And there was so much going on in the Lower East Side at that time, and it just seems very relevant, especially relevant. It's never been irrelevant. It's always relevant because the housing crisis is always relevant, and the gentrification is always relevant, sadly, in this country. But it's more relevant now than it's perhaps ever been, possibly. And we're looking at 40 million evictions in this country between now and the end of September if the government doesn't take radical action. And you were involved in a rent strike as well, in addition to in squatting and the Tompkins Square defense. And I wonder if you just have any particular thoughts for the current moment that people are now facing around the country.
I mean, I was involved as a very young man who just moved to the Lower East Side in a rent strike of this apartment. And that
very building, that must have been the building I visited you in then.
By these older people who, of all different ethnicities, who lived here a lot longer than me, some of whom had been anti-war activists during the 1960s and, holding meetings in the hall about what do we do about landlord. And I think the landlord really underestimated them. Didn't realize how much these people liked organizing, and because of that, I have a secure place to live because of their work, really. So I've always appreciated, the practical nature of tenant activism. One of the first demands of the squatter movement in the 1980s was a moratorium on eviction. Exactly those words. We called for a moratorium on evictions. And interestingly, right now we have a moratorium on evictions in New York City and in New York State and various other places around the country. So this idea seems to have taken on a life. Another issue that was really important in the Lower East Side in the 1980s was police violence. There was a young artist, about 2 years younger than I was. I was an art student. Maybe I should call him an art student. He was going to Pratt Institute, same school where I studied. He was living in Brooklyn, working at a bar called the Pyramid Club on Avenue A. I was living in the Lower East Side, and I was working at bars and restaurants and movie theaters and moving jobs. So essentially, we were the same class of people. Um, Michael Stewart was killed by the police. And I think it was apparent to me, as it was apparent to lots of us down here, that he was the only difference between him and the rest of us is that he was black. And the other difference was that he was killed by the police. So I think that we all became aware of this thing, police violence against black people. And, if Michael Stewart had not been killed, maybe you'd be interviewing him now. Maybe you'd be looking at his artwork. So it's a deep thing. Back in the 80s, most white people did not believe that this was going on. It was hard to convince people that this was going on because of the universality of video, that we've become a nation of filmmakers. Everybody knows that this happens.
Because back in the 80s, people just didn't leave their suburbs or something. I mean, I remember as a kid how shocking it was to me growing up in the suburb of Wilton, Connecticut, which is about 98% WASP, and then going to Norwalk, which is just south of Wilton. I mean, forget about New York, but just going to Norwalk as a kid and seeing how radically different life was in terms of the poverty and the police who were everywhere constantly. I mean,
Right, but it's not just the suburbs. I mean, as a white person, you have a suburb that you carry around with you. That
right.
A police officer, and provided you don't have long hair or a mohawk, and provided you look respectable, the police officer says, "Hi, how are you doing?" Whereas somebody else, they don't have that experience. And so it was very hard to convince a lot of white people back then who had positive experience with police that not everybody had those same experiences. Not everybody interacted with them the same way. And I think that because of the communication systems that have developed, it's now pretty hard to deny this is going on. Of course, there are people who still want to deny it, but they have to work at that.
Yeah, just if you're just on Benjamin Crump's Twitter feed, the lawyer who is often who defended the family of Michael Brown and Breonna Taylor and so many others. You look at his Twitter feed every day; he's sending out just another video that somebody sent him, who he's now defending. It's just daily, just on that one Twitter feed alone. But yeah, it is quite something. But of course, in the age of Rodney King, it was all captured on video, and all those cops were found not guilty, and their cops are constantly still being found not guilty all the time. And then people wonder why are these people always attacking the police station in Portland every night? Like, is this so hard to do the math here? It's not that complicated.
It's true.
What's it been like as I mean, when I think of people doing visual art as a musician, where we sort of, write songs, and it's a very solitary process, but then it's part of the expectation that you take it out in the world and perform it for people, and you've done some really interesting sort of performance using slideshows, much like what you did at the beginning there, and you do that publicly sometimes, right? But I mean, like, what's it been like in the pandemic in New York, where you're largely spending time alone anyway?
It's very complicated because my partner and I've been joking that we're way too good at social distancing.
Right.
As visual artists, we spend a lot of time at home working anyways. I mean, here's where I work, and that's normal for me. Whereas to other people, that's a very strange thing. Their social life is their job. They go out to their job and meet other people. Um, whereas, for me, my social life is either, going to clubs, teaching at schools, or going to demos. And my work is in my home. My real work is in my home. And, so in that sense, I'm getting a lot of work done because I'm locked up at home. On the other hand, the really disturbing thing has been how many of my friends got this disease. It's a long list. And some of my oldest friends, people I've worked with for years and years, fortunately, no one's died. Everybody seems to have gotten better. But when the disease first hit New York, I immediately heard from 3 different people who had it. And so that's pretty scary, pretty disturbing. I do think that, New York City has handled this very well. That the first month it was going on, it was completely insane here. And, nobody knew how far it was going to go, but it seems like people dealt with it very well. And, people have been suitably cautious. I went to, really the first time I got out of the house was for the Black Lives Matter protests. I went to about 4 of them. And 80 to 90% of the people at those protests were masked, which shouldn't be that surprising because we were always trying to get the police to let us wear masks.
Yeah, exactly, right? That contradiction is so hilarious. Like, now we can't go into a bank without a mask on? What?
Yeah, but I mean, most of the people were masked. And I felt that it seems like people did not get sick from going to those protests, even though there were thousands of people there. So if anything proves that masks work, it's the protests, actually.
Right.
And
what's been your feeling about the character of the protests? I mean, just somebody who's like old enough to have seen some other social movements in your life, particularly the very, very impressive movement in the 80s in Tompkins Square. What's your feeling about I mean, people are often calling the movement unprecedented, and there may be aspects of it that are unprecedented, but I think journalists like to throw around that term when they don't know what they're talking about.
Well, there's one thing that's unprecedented. The number of white people at a demonstration about police brutality. Never seen that before in my life. Back in the 1980s, I would go to the December 12th Coalition's protests against the killing of Black people by police. And you could count the white people at those protests on one hand. Literally one hand, and you probably knew 2 of the 3 white people you ran into. White people didn't go to it, and white people didn't think it was an issue. When I would talk to my white friends, even my white anarchist friends, they would talk to me like I'd done something really weird and crazy, to go to an anti-police brutality protest, like I was, hanging out with the cannibals waiting to get eaten or something. The fear of Black people was very strong in New York at that time,
Do you think there's something changed? Because, like, I mean, when I was in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, and I went to Michael Brown Jr.'s homecoming, there were 6,000 people in the church, and about 20 white people, and including me, and most of the others were journalists or politicians. And I found that incredibly disturbing, and I had no idea that there was going to be so few white people there showing solidarity, and it was shocking to me. And what was also interesting was, well, first of all, when I asked young white anti-racist activists around the St. Louis area why they were not there, they said they felt like it was culturally inappropriate for them to show up. But being there, what was so embarrassing about being there was that me and my white friend who I was there with, we were constantly being thanked by Black people for being there.
Yeah.
And I think if other white people who care about police brutality knew how welcome, how enthusiastically welcome they would have been, they might have been there maybe. But I mean, it was just a bizarre experience altogether.
I think it's a really complicated question, but I do see that the younger generation seem to be ready to go to these things and to support these things, and seem to also be able, at least from what I could see, to be respectful and accept the authority of the Black community on how they want the protests to go. People may have had other experiences, I don't know, but that's what I've seen.
Yeah.
And you know, that's, I think it's because people are more informed. You know, I do know that there has been a fair amount of looting in New York, right? The first week of the protests, I believe a lot of that looting was economically motivated and was not really was using the protest as a pretext. But there was already a lot of criminal activity in New York before the protests, because basically you've got a city full of closed up stores, and a whole lot of people out of work. What do you think is going to happen?
Exactly. And you think it's a coincidence that the looting in Chicago happened just a few days after those unemployment checks ran out.
Yeah. So, I tend to assume that's why that's happened. But, that's a complicated discussion. And I can't say that I was everywhere in New York to see everything that happened either. Because, it was a very strange landscape, which I tried to portray in this image, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where
you're bringing it up, right? Uh-huh. Oh yeah, that wonderful cover. Look at that
landscape where we're in our houses and people are in the street, and it just looks very strange right now. That very often the only people in the street for a while were the people protesting.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was just an odd thing.
Yeah, it is, and it is still. I mean, so many cities, including this one. I mean, like downtown in Portland is almost empty all the time, except if there's protests. So then you get protesters and cops and journalists and nobody else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The one thing that's been frustrating is that I don't know what platforms you use for communication, but I would like to do performances with the musicians I work with, but most of the platforms I work with, you can't have two soundtracks going at once. They're not in sync. I would have loved to come on here with Eric Blitz and John Wagner and the other musicians I work with and done a show for you, but I don't think it would have worked.
Syncing there are ways to make that work. It can work, and I've gotten technical explanations about how that works, and yeah, it can be done, but it's not like it happens automatically. There's so often a half-second delay, or some kind of delay that's not even noticeable necessarily, but then when you're trying to play music, it's a disaster. Yeah. But that is we're all getting better at live streaming, or at least some of us are. But there again, it's one of those sort of divides. It's another way to create a divide in society where some people get good at live streaming and others can't manage to get online at all.
I feel this is something that society wanted us to do. Anyways, like I teach at a college, an instructor at an art school, and people were so ready to move the school online.
Yeah.
Did it in a split second. I think every other business was like stumbling around about this, I think, but the colleges were like, yeah, we've been waiting for years to move this whole thing online. I think that, capitalism really wanted to move as much of the economy online as possible. I mean, a friend of mine who is a computer programmer used to tell me about this in the 90s. He'd say, eventually they're going to get rid of stores and sell everything online.
But the real estate companies or the developers that are renting out those commercial spaces, they're not those particular capitalists are not so happy.
Yeah, it's
but Yeah, and I wonder also as far as the looting goes. I always used to think looting was a bit of an antisocial activity until the rent went up by 250% here in Portland, and now looting and smashing windows just seems like a perfectly reasonable way to keep the rent down.
Okay.
But I mean, it's I think at some point once the rent goes up enough, then more and more people think that that's a reasonable activity,
Right.
and I'm not sure what the turning point is at which point people actually start engaging in the activity rather than just thinking of it as perfectly reasonable.
Well,
But I think we're at a point now where things are changing.
I mean, small business people are very financially vulnerable and are a very important part of the community. And
And they're not the ones getting looted here in Portland anyway. I mean, if you go, I don't know about New York, but if you go to downtown Portland, it's almost entirely big corporations. And when it's not a big corporation, it's a company like that's supposedly a small immigrant owned business with a name like what is it? World Trade. They actually called their business One World Trade Center or One World Trade, something World Trade on it. And it's like right there in the middle of downtown in the most expensive part of downtown. But apparently it's not a big corporation. So that's gotten a lot of press. They got their windows smashed. And yeah, evidently it's owned by an immigrant. And but if you start a business and you call it One World Trade Center and it's located in the most expensive part of town, you can expect to get your windows smashed in a riot, I think.
okay, I
I
mean,
mean,
I
whether or not it's the right move or not.
in the Lower East Side, we feel very attached to certain small businesses and the people who run them. You know,
Yeah,
we
of
really
course.
close. You know,
And they have been were small businesses really drastically affected during the Tompkins Square riots?
not in the initial 1988 riot. In the 1991 riot, they were very badly affected, and it was a divisive issue within the community. It broke a lot of the solidarity in the community that some small businesses were attacked in the 1991 riot, and it's part of what kind of brought that period to a close was the 1991 Memorial Day riot, in which a place called Moe's Discount Store was looted and the guy was forced out of business. And he was an immigrant small businessman who was running a discount store. He wasn't running.
Right. Wasn't even like a yuppie place.
Yeah. And so that caused a lot of disagreement within the community about, who is the protest and who does the protest really represent if they went after this guy. And so I think a lot of us learned a great deal from that we're a little cautious about the idea of, small players getting targeted, because people are angry and, have a justifiable reason for anger, but the person you're taking it out on isn't really the person responsible. So I think that's why, I flinch a little when we talk about looting and why
Mm-hmm.
some of us have been, we're very aware that like some very well respected neighborhood stores got their windows broken in the last set of protests. And we felt this was because younger people were involved who didn't really know the history and didn't really know the people in the neighborhood and maybe even come in from out of town.
It's so complex like that, right? Because there's so many different elements involved, including people who have never been to a protest in their lives, but they're just really angry, or they've lost their jobs, or they're more long-term politicized people that have a principle about which businesses to smash, or they don't believe in smashing anything. I mean, it's a whole wide array of people that keep on. But at least we can say that if it's outside agitators, they didn't come from very far outside because they were in all the cities in the country at the same time.
There you go.
It kind of makes the outside agitator theory a little harder to swallow. Like, okay, they might have come from the suburbs, but they didn't come from Seattle. No. But you've been involved with your arrest record is fairly lengthy, and you were you involved with a lot of defense of squats that were being raided by police, or eviction defense, or can you talk about that? Because I think eviction defense is
We're at Squat on Avenue C in the late 80s, early 90s, and we were involved in defending those buildings against police. And we had a radical housing movement in the Lower East Side that seized about 30 buildings. We had a massive situation of abandonment in New York City in the 1980s. Landlords had burned down their buildings to get insurance and to get rid of their rent-stabilized tenants.
Were landlords ever arrested for that or caught for that? Because I mean, I heard of those stories so often, but do you any idea?
Now and then, but rarely. Rarely. It was a pretty easy crime to cover up.
Yeah.
Because you're burning the evidence.
Right.
But there are landlords who've gone to jail for setting fire to their own buildings. There was one very recently who misconstructed their gas lines on several buildings on Second Avenue that blew up, and he has faced charges for it. But very often they got away, particularly, 70s and 80s when, you could get away with a lot of crimes around here, frankly. But that had left a lot of abandoned buildings and people were moving into them and fixing them up. And about 30 buildings were seized, and of those, eventually about half of those were legalized and the other half were lost over a 20-year process, which I had the honor and the privilege to be part of that process. Although I'm rent stabilized tenant and this is my permanent address, not a squat. But those squats became, some of them became legalized, and some of my friends continue to live in those buildings and have secure homes there. And the process of doing that, will be presented different ways, but the way it really worked was that when police would come to evict a building, we would call a phone tree. We would get hundreds of people on the streets. We would get lawyers. We would get priests. We would get community members. We would get media. There would have to be a large police present to deal with us. There was a diversity of tactics. There were people who would do nonviolent civil disobedience. There were people who would do violent civil disobedience. We were decentralized. There were people who would, just yell and scream. And so that did not prevent the evictions of most buildings. In a few cases it did. It usually didn't. But it meant that the evictions were very politically expensive, very financially expensive for the city. And eventually the Giuliani administration made a deal with the remaining 13 squats and legalized them. So people got permanent housing from that. And I believe that, and I think the people who negotiated that agreement will tell you, Michael Schenker certainly would have told you that that was because of the level of resistance that took place every time there was an eviction.
Yeah.
The fact that that concession came not from the liberals, not from David Dinkins or, Bill de Blasio, that came from Rudy Giuliani. So why did Rudy Giuliani agree to legalize a bunch of buildings that people had moved into and seized? Because he lived in the real world and knew that there would be real resistance for every time he evicted a building. He was going to have to call out the tanks and call out the police and go through a lot of bad publicity, a lot of expense. The police themselves didn't like showing up to these events. They knew it made them look bad and it put them in danger. So actually the police were in a weird way some of our advocates.
Right.
Because they didn't want to be in that situation. So, that's how people actually get things in the society. From what I can see, is that you get things in society by creating pressure.
Yeah. Did you guys have protests at the eviction court as well?
Nothing like what's going on now. We never tried to shut down the court. We actually tried to win in the courts and always got stuck. In fact, Mike Schenker used to say that the court was, kind of the opiate of the people, that, people went to court and they gave you hope. And then, and of course, hope was what was in the bottom of Pandora's box.
Hmm.
That people would go to court and they would think that they were going to get somewhere in court. They would put a lot of effort into presenting all this great information about themselves, and the case would seem to be going very well, and then the courts would like completely screw you. Legal tenants, certainly in New York State, do have a lot of strength in court. We do have good rent laws in New York. Squatters did not have a lot of strength in court. So courts have their value, but I think the protests that are closing down courts and eviction cases in the rest of the country are a really good thing, because we still have a moratorium on eviction that hasn't really happened here yet.
Right.
So in a lot of ways, but I've seen videos of people literally shutting down courts, housing courts, to prevent eviction procedures, and I think that's a great idea. It's a great idea to prevent things before it gets to the point where police are at your door. Absolutely.
And then when the police are at your door, like with the squats, I remember somebody talking about how in order to try to use the phone tree to get lots of people to come, part of the formula involved having good enough barricades that you could keep everybody out, keep the cops out for about an hour.
People built physical barricades to keep the police from coming in. And
then Giuliani was the one who got the battering ram on the tank or something like that, if I recall. Was it
the eviction of the 13th Street squad? And I think the tank was probably brought in because I have heard a rumor that the police cars that came, their tires were all slashed.
One of those rumors, yeah.
But they brought in a tank, or let's be fair, an armored personnel carrier. It did not have a turret. So it wasn't really a tank. It was a type of armored personnel carrier used by the U.S. military in Europe.
Right, a very important distinction. It's armored. It's made of metal. Yeah,
but it was a shocking image to a lot of people, and I think now it's actually more common. But that was really one of the first times people had seen like a blue and white painted armored personnel carrier driving through the streets of an American city.
Pioneering.
Well, yeah. Actually, the police commanders who we dealt with in Tompkins Square Park went around the world to teach their tactics to other police departments afterwards. That was apparently very important in their careers, was fighting the riots in Tompkins Park.
Yeah.
Guys like Bratton.
Bratton. Yeah, right.
But a number of them did this.
And what's that guy who was, police chief in Philadelphia and Miami, later went on to train police in somewhere in the Middle East? Yeah, I don't know. I think he also was involved. But
they had careers going from one city to another.
Yep.
Having cut their teeth on the 1988, 89, 90 riots in Tompkins Square Park.
Yeah. Seth, thanks so much for joining us. I don't know where the hour went, but it went, and I want to get you back on to talk more about more stuff later, if you'll be willing.
I would love to come on here with a number of the people from World War III Illustrated, because like I showed you, we have a wide diversity of artists on this issue, and we come out with the magazine once a year. We put our heart and soul in it. I'd love to have Mac McGill on this show. I'd love to have Sandy Jimenez on this show. Love to have JD Bradger on this show.
Great idea. Yeah.
I want to come back here.
Excellent.
By the way, we very much appreciate your music too.
Oh, thank you.
Say that.
Thank you. Take care, Seth. I'll see you around.
Okay, bye. Thanks.
And thank you all for joining this discussion with Seth Tobocman for Fifth State Live, which you can hear every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, Cable Community Radio, and elsewhere. You'll find all the Fifth Estate Live episodes at fifthestate.org, where you can also subscribe to the physical magazine. You can find these interviews and my other interviews archived in various places in the Discussions with David playlist at youtube.com/drovics and in audio form at soundcloud.com/davidrovics, at patreon.com/davidrovics, where you can also support my broadcasting efforts and check out lots of other content, or if you look for This Week with David Rovics on any podcasting platform. If you're somewhere in the region of Portland, Oregon, please go to artistsforrentcontrol.org and sign up for text notifications to be part of Portland Emergency Eviction Response to help us mobilize against the coming waves of evictions. I've got a crowdfunder for an album project going, also known as a musician and audio engineer employment scheme. You can check that out at davidrovics.com/pandemic sessions. Remember, don't pay the rent and don't be afraid of your neighbors. Mutual aid will get us through. See you soon. Bye for now.